The cold metal chair felt uncomfortable under Commander Zethkar's forearms. His gray skin looked pale under the bright lights of the detention room on Proxima Station. Two galactic investigators sat across from him at a simple table. Their recording devices blinked red as they waited for him to speak. Zethkar's large black eyes stared at the table for a long moment. His breathing was slow and heavy. When he finally looked up, his voice was quiet but clear. "You want to know about the humans," he said. "You want to know how they destroyed the greatest military force in the galaxy? Fine. I will tell you everything." The taller investigator, a blue-skinned Altarian, leaned forward. "Start with your first encounter with human forces." Zethkar closed his eyes. Even now, 3 years later, the memories made his heart beat faster. "It was at Kepler 442b. My commanders told me it would be easy. They said humans were weak, new to space travel, barely worth our attention." He opened his eyes and looked directly at the investigators. They were wrong about everything. The battle had started like so many others. Zethkar commanded a full war fleet of 200 ships. The biggest vessels were massive dreadnoughts, each one capable of destroying a small moon. His crew was made up of the best warriors in the hegemony. They had conquered dozens of worlds without breaking a sweat. Our intelligence reports said there was a minor human outpost on the fourth planet, Zethkar continued. Maybe 1,000 people, a few defense platforms, nothing that could threaten us. But when they arrived in the system, things looked different. There were 30 human ships waiting for them near the planet. The vessels were smaller than hegemony ships, but they moved in perfect formation. At their head was a command cruiser, broadcasting on all frequencies. "This is Commander Jake Morrison of the Terran Defense Force," the voice had said. "You are not welcome in this system. Turn around now, or we will make you leave." Zethkar had laughed at the message. 30 ships against 200. It was a joke. He sent back his own message telling the humans to surrender or be destroyed. Morrison's reply was simple: "Come and try." The battle began badly for the humans. Zethkar's heavy cruisers opened fire first, their plasma cannons tearing through space. 3 human ships exploded in the first minute. It looked like the fight would be over quickly. But then something strange happened. The human ships didn't retreat. Instead, they charged straight at the hegemony fleet. Their smaller size made them hard to hit, and they moved in ways that made no sense. Some ships flew upside down. Others spun while firing. It was like watching madmen pilot spacecraft. They fought like animals, Zethkar told the investigators. But smart animals. Every move had a purpose. Commander Morrison's ship led the charge. It was damaged early in the fight, with half its weapons destroyed and atmosphere leaking from a dozen holes. Any sane commander would have pulled back. Morrison kept fighting. Zethkar watched in horror as Morrison's ship rammed directly into one of the hegemony dreadnoughts. The human vessel was torn apart, but the explosion crippled the much larger ship. Morrison had traded his life and the lives of his crew to take out a vessel 10 times their size. But Morrison wasn't dead. Somehow he had made it to an escape pod. As Zethkar's forces tried to rescue survivors from the damaged dreadnought, Morrison's pod drifted close to another hegemony ship. The pod exploded, taking the second ship with it. "He turned himself into a weapon," Zethkar said, his voice shaking slightly. "He used his own escape pod as a bomb." The other human ships saw what Morrison had done. Instead of being scared, they seemed inspired. One by one, damaged human vessels began ramming hegemony ships. They turned their own reactors into bombs, sacrificing themselves to take out enemies. Captain Lisa Hayes commanded a squadron of 6 human fighters. When her ships were surrounded by hegemony destroyers, she didn't try to escape. Instead, she ordered her pilots to link their ships together and detonate all their reactors at once. The explosion destroyed 12 hegemony vessels. "It was insane," Zethkar said. "They were throwing their lives away. But they were taking us with them." The real shock came when the trap was revealed. While Zethkar's forces were fighting the human ships, they had been slowly pulled into an asteroid field. The humans had been broadcasting fake distress signals from the asteroids, making it look like they had hidden bases there. When Zethkar's fleet moved in to destroy these bases, they found nothing but empty rocks. But the humans had been busy. They had placed weapons and bombs throughout the asteroid field. Every rock was a potential threat. The largest asteroid suddenly split open. Inside was a hidden human base with Captain Ben Parker in command. His ships had been waiting silently, their engines cold to avoid detection. When they powered up and attacked, the hegemony fleet was caught completely off guard. Parker's forces attacked from behind while the remaining ships from Morrison's group hit from the front. The hegemony fleet was trapped in a crossfire with nowhere to run. The asteroids made it impossible to use their larger ships effectively. Parker's timing was perfect, Zethkar admitted. They had planned this from the beginning. Every move, every sacrifice, it was all leading to this moment. The battle turned into a nightmare for the hegemony forces. Human ships appeared from behind asteroids, fired their weapons, and disappeared again. They used the rocks as shields and weapons, pushing asteroids into hegemony ships or hiding behind them to avoid return fire. One human pilot, Lieutenant Danny Walsh, used his damaged fighter to push a massive asteroid into the path of a hegemony battleship. The collision destroyed both the asteroid and the battleship. Walsh's fighter was crushed in the impact, but he had taken out a ship carrying 3,000 enemy soldiers. The humans had another advantage that Zethkar hadn't expected. They knew the asteroid field perfectly. Every rock, every hiding spot, every safe path through the debris. They moved through the field like they had lived there their whole lives. Later, Zethkar learned the truth. The humans had been preparing this battlefield for months. They had mapped every asteroid, placed sensors and weapons throughout the field, and practiced their attack patterns until they were perfect. What looked like a desperate last stand was actually a carefully planned ambush. The final blow came when the human base inside the largest asteroid revealed its true purpose. It wasn't just a hiding place for ships. It was a massive weapons platform. Captain Parker had turned an entire asteroid into a gun. The asteroid weapon fired once. The beam cut through space and struck Zethkar's flagship. Half the ship simply disappeared, turned to vapor by the intense energy. The rest was left drifting and powerless. By the time the battle ended, the hegemony had lost 47 ships. The humans lost 26. In any normal military thinking, the humans should have been completely destroyed. Instead, they had won a crushing victory. Zethkar was rescued from his dying flagship by his remaining forces. As they retreated from the system, he watched the human ships regroup. They didn't chase the fleeing hegemony fleet. They just watched them go, as if they had known exactly how the battle would end. That was when I first understood, Zethkar told the investigators. We weren't fighting primitive beings. We were fighting something much more dangerous. We were fighting humans who were willing to die to protect their home, and they were smart enough to make sure their deaths counted. The investigator made notes on his tablet. What happened next? Zethkar's expression grew even darker. Next came the ground war. That was when I learned that human soldiers are even more terrifying than their pilots. He paused, his 4 hands trembling slightly, on the table. But that is a story for another time. The recording device hummed softly as Commander Zethkar took a deep breath. His 4 arms folded across his chest as he prepared to continue his story. The 2 investigators waited patiently, knowing that what came next would be even more disturbing than the space battle. After the disaster at Kepler 442b, my superiors were angry, Zethkar began. They said I had been careless, that any competent commander could handle a few human farmers, so they gave me a chance to prove myself. He paused, his large black bee eyes staring at something the investigators could not see. They sent me to invade New Terra, a human farming colony with maybe 50,000 people. Most of them were families, children, old people. The intelligence report said they had no military training and only basic weapons. The blue-skinned investigator leaned forward. What made this different from a normal invasion? Zethkar's laugh was bitter and cold. Everything. Absolutely everything. The invasion had started normally enough. 50,000 hegemony troops landed on New Terra's main continent at dawn. They expected to control the planet within hours. The colony's main city was small and spread out with wide streets perfect for military vehicles. The surrounding farmland was flat and open, with nowhere for defenders to hide. "We had more soldiers than they had people," Zethkar said. "Our weapons were better. Our armor was stronger. Our vehicles were faster. On paper, it should have been easy." But the humans of New Terra had been preparing. When the first hegemony dropships landed, they found the landing zones empty. No civilians running in panic. No government officials trying to surrender. Just empty fields and abandoned buildings. The real fighting began when Sergeant Danny Cooper made contact with the hegemony forces. Cooper had been a farmer before that morning. He grew corn and raised cattle on a 1,000-acre spread outside the main city. He had never been a soldier, but he had spent his whole life on New Terra and knew every inch of the land. Cooper's first message to the hegemony forces was broadcast on all frequencies. His voice was calm and steady, like he was discussing the weather. "You're not welcome here," he said. "Leave now or we'll make you leave." Zethkar had laughed when he heard the message. One farmer threatening an army of 50,000. It seemed like a joke. He sent a response telling Cooper to surrender or watch his people die. Cooper's reply came in the form of explosions. The main road leading to the city suddenly erupted in a line of fire that stretched for 2 miles. 12 hegemony tanks were destroyed in seconds. The bombs had been buried under the road surface, hidden so well that even military scanners hadn't detected them. Cooper had turned his own farm equipment into weapons, Zethkar explained. Fertilizer became explosives, tractors became armored vehicles, irrigation pipes became rocket launchers. The first real shock came when Zethkar's forces tried to advance through the farmland. What looked like empty fields were actually carefully prepared kill zones. Cooper and his neighbors had spent months digging tunnels under their own crops. They could appear anywhere, attack and disappear back underground before the hegemony troops could respond. The humans used their knowledge of the land in ways Zethkar had never imagined. They knew which fields would be muddy after rain, making them perfect for trapping heavy vehicles. They knew which roads were strong enough to support tanks and which would collapse under the weight. They turned their own home into a maze that only they could navigate. Cooper's people fought like nothing Zethkar had ever seen. They used children as messengers, sending them through ventilation systems and drainage pipes too small for hegemony soldiers. The kids could appear anywhere, deliver information or supplies, and vanish again before anyone could catch them. One 10-year-old girl named Lucy Martinez became a legend among the resistance. She could crawl through the colony's water pipes and emerge inside hegemony command posts. She would leave small bombs or steal important documents, then disappear back into the pipe system. The hegemony never caught her, and she caused more damage than some entire military units. The elderly colonists were just as dangerous. They provided sniper support from grain silos and farmhouse windows. Many of them were former soldiers from other wars, and their shooting skills were excellent. An old man named Pete Johnson killed 17 hegemony officers with a hunting rifle before they even knew where he was hiding. Johnson was 73 years old, Zethkar said. He had arthritis in his hands and could barely walk without a cane. But he could hit a target at 800 yards in the dark. The most terrifying moment came during the 3rd week of fighting. Staff Sergeant Amy Rodriguez, who had been a school teacher before the invasion, led a group of teenagers in a raid on the main hegemony command post. The kids were between 15 and 18 years old. None of them had military training. Rodriguez had turned her students into a commando unit. They knew the colony's layout better than anyone and could move through areas that hegemony forces thought were secure. For their raid on the command post, they used nothing but hunting rifles and homemade smoke grenades made from chemicals stolen from the school laboratory. The attack came at night during a thunderstorm. The teenagers approached the command post through the colony's storm drain system. They emerged inside the compound's perimeter and attacked from 6 different directions at once. The fighting lasted only 15 minutes. When it was over, Rodriguez and her students had captured the complete hegemony battle plans, destroyed most of the communication equipment, and killed or wounded 30 enemy soldiers. Then they disappeared back into the drain system, leaving no trace of how they had gotten in or out. A teacher and her high school students had just raided our most secure facility, Zethkar said, his voice filled with disbelief even years later. They took our classified information and got away clean. Our best security couldn't stop a group of children. The psychological warfare was just as effective as the physical attacks. Cooper's resistance broadcast daily messages to the hegemony, troops describing exactly how the invasion was failing. They knew details about hegemony casualties, supply problems, and troop movements that should have been impossible for civilians to obtain. Captain Tony Walsh, who had been the colony's communications director, turned the local radio station into a propaganda weapon. He broadcast personal messages to individual hegemony soldiers, somehow knowing their names, their ranks, and details about their families back home. The effect on troop morale was devastating. Walsh knew more about our soldiers than their own commanders did, Zethkar explained. He would broadcast birthday wishes to their children or condolences for family members who had died. It was like he could see into our personal lives. The resistance also used captured hegemony equipment against its former owners. Every weapon they took became part of their arsenal. Every vehicle they captured was turned into a weapon or trap. They learned to use hegemony technology faster than anyone thought possible. Mike Turner, a mechanic who had repaired farm equipment, became an expert at modifying hegemony weapons. He could take a standard plasma rifle and improve its power output by 30%. He turned captured tanks into remote-controlled bombs that could be driven into enemy positions. The final humiliation came when the hegemony tried to use their air superiority. They sent fighter aircraft to bomb suspected resistance positions. But Cooper's people had prepared for this too. They had stolen surface-to-air missiles from the hegemony's own supply depots and hidden them throughout the colony. Lieutenant Kate Phillips, who had been a crop duster pilot before the war, led the air defense efforts. She used her knowledge of local weather patterns and terrain to predict exactly where enemy aircraft would fly. Her missile team shot down 11 hegemony fighters in one afternoon. After 3 weeks of fighting, Zethkar's forces controlled only the original landing zone. Everything else remained in human hands. The hegemony had superior numbers, better weapons, and more training, but they couldn't defeat an enemy that knew the battlefield better than they knew themselves. We were fighting ghosts, Zethkar told the investigators. They were everywhere and nowhere. Every building could hide an enemy. Every child could be a spy. Every old farmer could be a sniper. We controlled nothing except the ground we were standing on. The breaking point came when Cooper himself approached the hegemony lines under a flag of truce. He wanted to talk. Zethkar agreed to meet with him, expecting the farmer to surrender. Instead, Cooper offered the hegemony forces safe passage off the planet. "You can leave now with honor," he said, "or you can stay and die slowly. Your choice." Zethkar looked at the simple farmer who had brought his army to its knees. Cooper was covered in dirt and hadn't slept in days, but his eyes were steady and confident. He wasn't bluffing. "I realized that we weren't fighting farmers," Zethkar said quietly. "We were fighting people who would die before they let strangers take their home, and they were smart enough to make us die first." The hegemony forces withdrew from New Terra the next day, 50,000 professional soldiers defeated by civilians with farm tools and determination. The investigator made notes on his tablet. "How did this change your understanding of humans?" Zethkar was quiet for a long moment. "It taught me that humans don't just fight for territory or resources." Commander Zethkar's hands shook as he reached for the water container on the table. The investigators waited while he took a long drink. When he set the container down, his breathing was heavy and uneven. "The third encounter," he said slowly, "still gives me nightmares. It was worse than any battle I had ever fought. It showed me something about humans that I wish I had never learned." The taller investigator adjusted his recording device. "What happened?" Zethkar closed his eyes and was quiet for several seconds. When he opened them again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We captured one of their officers, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Parker. It seemed like a victory at the time. We thought we could use him to learn about human military tactics. The capture had happened during a skirmish near the Vega system. Parker's ship had been damaged while protecting a convoy of civilian transports. Instead of abandoning his post, he had stayed behind to fight a delaying action while the civilians escaped. His ship was destroyed, but he survived in an escape pod. Parker was a career military officer with 25 years of experience. He knew classified information about human fleet movements, base locations, and defense plans. The hegemony considered him a valuable prize. "We treated him well," Zethkar said. "He was kept in comfortable quarters on our prison transport ship. We gave him good food and medical care. We even allowed him to communicate with other human prisoners." The prison ship was one of the most secure vessels in the hegemony fleet. It was designed to hold dangerous criminals and enemy officers. The ship had thick armor, powerful weapons, and a crew of elite guards. Nothing had ever escaped from it. Parker was being transported to a maximum security facility on the hegemony homeworld. The journey would take 2 weeks through heavily patrolled space. There was no chance of rescue. Every military expert agreed that Parker would spend the rest of the war in captivity. They were wrong. The attack came on the 5th day of the journey. A single human ship dropped out of hyperspace directly in front of the prison convoy. The vessel was small and old, clearly a civilian freighter that had been modified for combat. It was outnumbered 20 to 1. The ship's name was Mercy's Edge, Zethkar said. It was commanded by Captain Kelly Brooks. At first we thought it was a mistake. One civilian ship against an entire convoy. It was suicide. Brooks broadcast a message on all frequencies. Her voice was calm and professional, like she was discussing a routine cargo delivery. "This is Captain Kelly Brooks of the Terran Merchant, vessel Mercy's Edge. We demand the immediate release of Lieutenant Colonel Steve Parker and all other human prisoners." The convoy commander laughed at the demand. He told Brooks to surrender or be destroyed. Her response was immediate. "Come and take us." The battle began badly for the humans. The Mercy's Edge was outgunned by every ship in the convoy. Its civilian hull was not designed for combat, and its improvised weapons were no match for military-grade systems. Within minutes, the ship was badly damaged and leaking atmosphere. But Brooks kept fighting. Her ship moved in ways that made no sense, using damage to its advantage. When the main engines were destroyed, she used the explosion as a weapon, ramming the burning wreckage into a hegemony destroyer. "She was insane," Zethkar said. Her ship was falling apart around her, but she kept attacking. "I watched her bridge explode, and she was still giving orders from the wreckage." The real shock came when Zethkar learned who Kelly Brooks was. She was Steve Parker's daughter. She had taken her civilian freighter, gathered a crew of volunteers, and launched a rescue mission that everyone knew was impossible. Brooks had modified her cargo hold into a weapons platform. She had installed missile launchers made from mining equipment and energy weapons built from industrial lasers. Her crew was made up of civilian volunteers who had never been in combat before. Tony Martinez was the ship's engineer. He had been a maintenance worker at a space station before the war. When the Mercy's Edge was critically damaged, he volunteered to manually overload the reactor. He stayed at his post while the rest of the crew evacuated, knowing that he would die in the explosion. Martinez could have saved himself, Zethkar explained. He had time to reach an escape pod. Instead, he stayed behind to make sure the explosion would be big enough to cripple our flagship. The reactor explosion tore the Mercy's Edge apart, but it also disabled 3 hegemony ships. In the chaos that followed, Brooks used the last working escape pod to ram another enemy vessel. She died manning a gun turret that had been torn from her ship's hull. The sacrifice of the Mercy's Edge created enough confusion for Steve Parker to escape. He led 47 other human prisoners in a breakout that succeeded only because the hegemony guards were dealing with the external attack. Parker and his fellow prisoners stole a hegemony shuttle and escaped to a nearby human outpost. But what terrified Zethkar was not the tactical success of the rescue. It was learning the personal cost. Kelly Brooks had given her life to save her father. Every member of her crew had volunteered for a mission they knew was hopeless. I asked one of the captured crew members why they had come, Zethkar said. He told me that Brooks had explained the odds to everyone. 0 chance of survival, Minimal chance of success. Every single person volunteered anyway. The crew of the Mercy's Edge included people from all walks of life. There was Janet Walsh, a school teacher who operated the improvised missile systems. Pete Johnson, a retired doctor who served as the ship's medic. Danny Miller, a teenager who had lied about his age to join the mission. None of them were soldiers. None of them had combat training. They were ordinary people who had volunteered to die because they believed it was the right thing to do. Johnson was 68 years old. Seth Carr continued. He had grandchildren, a comfortable retirement. He could have lived peacefully for many more years. Instead, he chose to die on a burning spaceship because a fellow human needed help. The youngest volunteer was Lisa Martinez, Tony's sister. She was only 19 and had just started college. When she learned about the mission, she begged to be included. Brooks initially refused, saying she was too young. Lisa argued that age didn't matter when someone's family needed help. Lisa operated the communications system during the battle. When the ship's main computer was destroyed, she manually coordinated the weapon systems using calculations she did in her head. She died at her post when the bridge was hit by enemy fire. The most disturbing part for Zethkar was learning how the crew had prepared for the mission. They had recorded goodbye messages for their families. They had written wills and letters to be delivered after their deaths. They had made peace with dying before they ever left port. They knew, Zethkar said, his voice breaking slightly. Every one of them knew they were going to die. They said goodbye to their families and came. Anyway, they came because Steve Parker was someone's father, someone's husband, someone's friend. But the humans had also planned for success. If they somehow managed to rescue Parker and survive, they had arranged for supply caches and safe houses along escape routes. They had backup plans for their backup plans, even though they expected to die. Captain Mike Turner commanded a second human ship that arrived just as the battle was ending. His vessel was even smaller than the Mercy's Edge, but it was fast enough to evacuate survivors. Turner risked his own ship and crew to save 3 wounded prisoners who had escaped from the Hegemony shuttle. Turner could have stayed hidden, Zethkar explained. The battle was over. The rescue had succeeded, but he saw injured humans floating in space and couldn't leave them behind. Turner's ship, the Swift Current, was a converted racing yacht with a crew of 12. They had followed the Mercy's Edge at a distance, hoping to help with the rescue. When they saw the explosion, they moved in to search for survivors. The Swift Current managed to rescue 8 people from the wreckage, including 2 Hegemony soldiers who had been aboard a damaged ship. Turner's crew treated the enemy wounded, just as carefully as they treated their own people. I asked Turner why he had saved our soldiers, Zethkar said. He looked at me like I had asked a stupid question. He said, "They were hurt. That's reason enough." The investigation after the battle revealed the full scope of the human rescue operation. Brooks had spent weeks planning the mission, studying convoy routes and security procedures. She had mortgaged her ship and borrowed money to buy weapons and supplies. She had recruited volunteers from across human space. The most shocking discovery was that Brooks had turned down help from the official military. Human fleet commanders had offered to send warships to assist with the rescue. Brooks refused, saying that military involvement would escalate the conflict and put more people at risk. She chose to die rather than start a bigger war, Zethkar said. She believed that her father's life was worth her own, but not worth the lives of thousands of other people who would die in a larger battle. The human government had not authorized the rescue mission. Brooks and her volunteers had acted on their own, without official support or approval. They had risked not only their lives but also their citizenship by attacking a Hegemony convoy. But when news of the rescue reached human space, Brooks became a hero. Streets were named after her. Statues were built in her honor. The detention room felt colder as Commander Zethkar began the 4th part of his story. His forearms wrapped around himself as if trying to ward off a chill that came from memory rather than temperature. The investigators noticed his discomfort, but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. After the rescue at Vega, my superiors decided that humans were more dangerous than we had thought, Zethkar said. But they still believed we could break them. They chose the strongest fortress in our empire for the final test. They wanted to prove that human determination had limits. He paused, his breathing shallow. They sent me to defend Fortress Prime. Fortress Prime was the most powerful military installation the Hegemony had ever built. It sat on a dead planet in the center of Hegemony space, surrounded by defensive satellites and patrol fleets. The fortress itself was carved into a mountain, with walls 50 feet thick and weapons that could destroy entire fleets. 10 million Hegemony soldiers lived and worked in Fortress Prime. It had its own factories, farms, and power plants. The fortress could survive for years without any outside help. Military experts called it the most secure place in the galaxy. We thought it was impossible to capture, Zethkar said. The fortress had never been attacked. No enemy had ever even tried. When the humans arrived, we almost felt sorry for them. General Rick Stone commanded the human forces that came to Fortress Prime. Stone was different from other human commanders. Zethkar had fought. He was older, quieter, and seemed to think more than he spoke. He had studied every major battle in galactic history and understood warfare better than most species understood breathing. Stone brought a fleet of 300 ships to attack Fortress Prime. It was a large force, but still smaller than the defensive fleet protecting the fortress. The human ships took positions around the planet and waited, and waited, and waited. At first, we thought they were planning a massive assault. Zethkar explained. We prepared for the biggest battle of the war, but the attack never came. The humans just sat there watching us. Days passed without any fighting. The human ships moved in slow patterns around the planet, but they never came close enough to engage. They ignored messages from the fortress and didn't respond to warnings. They simply waited. General Stone's strategy was unlike anything the Hegemony had seen before. He didn't want to attack Fortress Prime. He wanted to starve it. While his ships kept the defensive fleet busy, other human forces were working throughout Hegemony space. Colonel Janet Walsh led teams that attacked supply convoys heading to Fortress Prime. She didn't just destroy the supplies, she studied the convoy routes and schedules, learning exactly how the fortress received food, fuel, and ammunition. Then she systematically cut off every supply line. Walsh's forces were like shadows moving through space. They would appear at a supply depot, destroy everything useful, and disappear before help could arrive. They hit fuel stations, communication relays, and repair facilities. Slowly, carefully, they isolated Fortress Prime from the rest of the Hegemony. Walsh understood our logistics better than our own supply officers, Zethkar said. She knew which supplies were critical and which were just convenient. She knew how long we could survive without resupply, and exactly when we would start to feel the pressure. The psychological warfare began during the second month of the siege. Captain Mike Turner had hijacked Hegemony communication arrays throughout the sector. Instead of destroying them, the humans used them to broadcast messages directly to the soldiers inside Fortress Prime. Turner's broadcasts were carefully crafted to be as disturbing as possible. He didn't threaten the soldiers or try to scare them. Instead, he told them the truth about what was happening in the galaxy. He described Hegemony defeats in other systems. He explained how their families were suffering while the war continued. Turner somehow knew personal details about our soldiers, Zethkar said. He would broadcast birthday greetings to their children. He would mention when their spouses lost jobs because of the war. He knew things that should have been impossible for an enemy to know. The most effective broadcasts came from captured Hegemony officers who had chosen to cooperate with the humans. These officers explained why they had switched sides and urged their former comrades to do the same. They described how well they were being treated as prisoners and how the humans offered better terms than the Hegemony government. Captain Ben Parker, the nephew of the rescued Steve Parker, led many of these broadcasts. He had been captured during an earlier battle, but had impressed his human captors with his intelligence and honesty. The humans had offered him a choice: remain a prisoner or help them end the war more quickly. Parker chose to help. His broadcasts to Fortress Prime were some of the most effective propaganda the humans produced. He spoke directly to soldiers he had served with, using personal stories and shared memories to convince them that continued fighting was pointless. Parker knew exactly what to say to each unit, Zethkar remembered. He had served with many of the officers in Fortress Prime. He knew their fears, their hopes, their reasons for fighting. He used that knowledge to break their will to continue. The real psychological blow came when Turner began broadcasting footage of hegemony leaders living in luxury while their soldiers suffered. Hidden cameras showed government officials eating expensive food and enjoying entertainment while rationing was imposed on military bases. The footage was devastating to morale. Soldiers in Fortress Prime were eating emergency rations while their leaders held elaborate dinner parties. Military families were struggling to pay for basic necessities while politicians lived in mansions and flew in private ships. Turner showed us images of our own commanders laughing and drinking while we starved, Zethkar said, his voice filled with old anger. They were safe in their palaces while we faced death every day. The broadcasts made us question everything. We had been told about the war. The breaking point came during the 4th month of the siege. Food supplies in Fortress Prime were running low, and fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The fortress was designed to be self-sufficient, but only for a few months. Stone had calculated exactly how long they could hold out, and his timeline was proving accurate. But the real crisis wasn't about supplies. It was about hope. The soldiers in Fortress Prime began to realize that no relief force was coming. Every attempt to break the human blockade had failed. Every supply convoy had been destroyed or captured. They were truly alone. The human broadcasts had created doubt about the war itself. Soldiers began to question whether they were fighting for a good cause or just to protect corrupt leaders. They wondered if their families would be better off if the war ended, even if it meant hegemony defeat. Danny Walsh, Turner's communications specialist, created the most effective broadcast of the entire siege. He had intercepted personal messages from hegemony families to their loved ones in Fortress Prime. Instead of blocking these messages, he broadcast them publicly. The messages were heartbreaking. Wives describing how they couldn't afford food for their children. Parents talking about sons and daughters who had died in battles on distant worlds. Children asking when their fathers would come home from a war they didn't understand. Walsh let us hear our own families begging us to come home, Zethkar said, his voice cracking slightly. They weren't asking us to win. They were asking us to survive. They wanted the war to end so we could be together again. The fortress's commander tried to block the broadcasts, but the humans had infiltrated too many communication systems. Every attempt to jam the signals failed. The messages kept coming, each one more personal and devastating than the last. The final straw came when the humans broadcast a message from the hegemony's own medical corps. Doctors and nurses described the casualties from the war, not just numbers but personal stories of young soldiers who would never go home. They talked about treating children injured in bombing raids and families torn apart by the fighting. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, a human medic who had been captured and released, appeared in some of these broadcasts. She described how both human and hegemony medical personnel had worked together to save lives during temporary ceasefires. She showed that even in war, there were people on both sides who cared more about healing than hurting. Rodriguez made us see that the humans weren't monsters, Zethkar explained. They were people like us with families and hopes and fears. They were fighting us, but they didn't hate us. They just wanted the war to end. The surrender began with individual soldiers. Small groups would leave the fortress under flags of truce, asking to speak with human commanders. Stone accepted every surrender personally, treating each defector with respect and ensuring they were well cared for. The defections started slowly but gained momentum as word spread about how well the humans treated prisoners. Soldiers learned that captured hegemony personnel received good food, medical care, and the opportunity to communicate with their families. Many prisoners were even allowed to work in non-combat roles, earning money to send home. Major Pete Johnson was one of the first high-ranking officers to defect. He had commanded a battalion in Fortress Prime but became convinced that continued fighting would only lead to more death. His defection encouraged others to follow, creating a cascade of surrenders. The recording device captured every word as Commander Zethkar began the final part of his testimony. His posture had changed during the interview. Where he had started tense and frightened, he now sat straighter, almost at peace. The investigators sensed that this last story would be different from the others. After I surrendered at Fortress Prime, I expected to die, Zethkar said quietly. In hegemony culture, captured commanders are executed as examples to others. I thought humans would do the same. I was wrong about everything. The surrender had happened on a cold morning when the fortress's remaining defenders simply walked, out with their hands raised. Zethkar had been among the last to leave, carrying only his personal sidearm, which he placed on the ground as a symbol of defeat. Admiral Kate Phillips was waiting for him. She was a small woman by human standards, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had commanded fleets in dozens of battles. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her uniform was clean but showed signs of long wear. Phillips could have humiliated me, Zethkar explained. She could have made a show of my surrender, paraded me in front of cameras, used my defeat for propaganda. Instead, she treated me like a fellow officer who had simply been on the wrong side of a difficult war. Phillips's first words to Zethkar were not about surrender terms or prisoner arrangements. She asked if he was injured and whether his soldiers needed medical attention. When Zethkar said that several of his officers had been wounded in the final days of the siege, Phillips immediately called for medical teams. Dr. Pete Johnson arrived within minutes of Phillips's call. Johnson was a human military doctor who had served throughout the war. He had treated both human and hegemony wounded, often working in field hospitals under enemy fire. His medical bag was old and well used, showing the wear of countless emergency surgeries. Johnson examined my wounded soldiers with the same care he would have given to humans, Zethkar said. He didn't see enemies. He saw patients who needed help. That was my first hint that humans were different from what I'd been taught. Johnson worked for hours treating hegemony wounded. He used human medical supplies that were desperately needed for their own forces. When Zethkar asked why he would waste valuable resources on enemy soldiers, Johnson looked at him with surprise. He said that wounded soldiers weren't enemies anymore, Zethkar remembered. They were just people who needed healing. Johnson told me that his oath as a doctor was to help anyone who was hurt, regardless of which side they had fought for. Most shocking moment came when Johnson encountered a young hegemony soldier who had lost his leg in the final bombardment. The soldier was barely 18 years old and had been in his first battle. He was terrified and in tremendous pain, crying for his mother in the hegemony language. Johnson spent 3 hours operating on the young soldier, using advanced human surgical techniques to save his life. When the surgery was over, Johnson sat with the boy until he woke up, speaking gently in broken hegemony words he had learned specifically to comfort wounded prisoners. Johnson could have let the boy die, Zethkar said. It would have been easier and saved supplies. Instead, he worked harder to save that enemy soldier than some doctors worked to save their own people. I couldn't understand why. Admiral Phillips explained the human approach to prisoners of war during Zethkar's first interrogation, but it wasn't really an interrogation at all. Phillips offered him food and water, then asked if he wanted to talk about ending the war more quickly to save lives on both sides. Phillips had studied Zethkar's military record before their meeting. She knew about his family, his career, and his reputation as an honorable commander. She spoke to him not as a conqueror speaking to the conquered, but as one professional soldier speaking to another. Phillips told me that she respected my service to my people, Zethkar said. She said that loyalty was an admirable quality, even when it was loyalty to a cause she opposed. She made me feel like my years of service had meant something even though I had lost. The conversation that changed everything happened on Zethkar's third day in human custody. Phillips asked him about his family, and he mentioned that his eldest son had been killed in the war's first year. Phillips was quiet for a long moment, then told him about her own son who had died in a battle against hegemony forces. The two commanders, enemies for years, spent an hour sharing stories about their lost children. They talked about the pride they had felt watching their sons grow up, and the grief that came with losing them to a war that seemed to have no end. I realized that Phillips and I were more alike than different, Zethkar said. We had both lost children to this war, We both wanted it to end so that other parents wouldn't have to suffer what we had suffered. Captain Ben Parker was put in charge of the prisoner rehabilitation program. Parker was the nephew of Steve Parker, the officer who had been rescued by his daughter's sacrifice. Instead of treating the prisoners as enemies, Parker worked to help them understand human perspectives on the war. Parker organized discussion groups where human and hegemony officers could talk openly about their experiences. These sessions were voluntary, but most prisoners chose to participate. They wanted to understand the people who had defeated them. Parker never tried to convince us that humans were perfect, Zethkar explained. He admitted that humans had made mistakes during the war, but he helped us see that humans fought for principles, not just territory or resources. The rehabilitation program included classes on human history and culture. Former hegemony soldiers learned about human concepts of democracy, individual rights, and peaceful cooperation between different species. Many prisoners were surprised to discover that human society included aliens who lived as equal citizens. Lieutenant Danny Miller taught one of these classes. Miller had been a teacher before the war and had volunteered for military service when the fighting began. He had lost friends in battles against hegemony forces, but he showed no hatred toward his former enemies. Miller's classes covered human philosophy and ethics. He explained why humans believed that all intelligent species deserved freedom and self-determination. He described how human society had evolved from tribal warfare to global cooperation to interstellar alliance. Miller made us understand that humans didn't want to conquer the galaxy. Zethkar said, they wanted to create a community where different species could work together. They fought us because we threatened that vision, not because they hated us. The most powerful lesson came from Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, who had worked in human medical stations throughout the war. Rodriguez had treated wounded soldiers from both sides and had seen the cost of the conflict in personal terms. Rodriguez shared stories of young soldiers from both armies who had died far from home. She talked about the letters she had helped, dying warriors write to their families. She described the dreams and hopes that were lost when the fighting claimed another life. Rodriguez helped us see that war was a tragedy for everyone involved, Zethkar said. She showed us that humans understood the cost of victory and took no joy in the suffering they had been forced to cause. The turning point in Zethkar's thinking came when he was allowed to communicate with his family. He expected the humans to monitor or censor his messages. Instead, they helped him send private communications to his wife and remaining children. Captain Amy Walsh, who managed prisoner communications, worked personally with Zethkar to establish contact with his family. She helped him navigate human communication systems and even translated messages when language barriers arose. Walsh spent hours helping me talk to my family, Zethkar remembered. She could have assigned the task to a subordinate or ignored my requests entirely. Instead, she made it her personal responsibility to reunite families torn apart by the war. The most emotional moment came when Zethkar's youngest daughter sent him a video message. She was only 12 years old and had been 6 when the war began. In the message, she said that she missed him and hoped he would come home soon. Walsh was in the room when Zethkar watched the message. She saw him break down in tears at the sight of his daughter, who had grown so much during his years away. Instead of leaving him alone or showing embarrassment, Walsh sat quietly with him while he cried. Walsh understood that even enemy commanders were parents who missed their children, Zethkar said. She gave me the dignity of grieving in private, while still offering comfort when I needed it. The final revelation came when Admiral Phillips offered Zethkar a choice. He could remain a prisoner until the war ended, return to hegemony space as part of a prisoner exchange, or request asylum in human territory as a refugee. Phillips explained that several former hegemony officers had chosen asylum and were working to help rebuild worlds damaged by the war. They were treated as equals and given meaningful work helping to create a better future for all species. Phillips wasn't trying to recruit me as a spy or propaganda tool, Zethkar said. She was offering me a chance to start over, to help heal the damage the war had caused. She believed that former enemies could become allies if they shared common goals. Zethkar chose asylum. He began working with human reconstruction teams, using his knowledge of hegemony infrastructure to help repair damaged worlds. He found purpose in